I think this is the spot where I'm supposed to drop in. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Katie, for inviting me and everyone who had a voice in that. And thank you for constructing such a beautiful community and a service this morning. Karen, the piano playing you're doing today is kind of blowing my mind. I don't know if I can talk today. I think we just should replay the musical passages. Somebody recorded that, right? No, I'm being facetious, but I remember a line from, you made me remember a line from Beethoven that I have in my office at school where I haven't been in a year and a half. And the line is, music is a higher truth than philosophy. And I think about that a lot because I'm in the business of philosophy, but I also play music and love music like everybody. And it's just a fascinating question. What is the best way of expressing our longing, our mystery? And music wins every time, right? But I have a few things to say today, and I hope I don't completely derail this beautiful service. But I'm thinking about Emerson, and I'm just so grateful that I'm here and that you invited me. I got to start here. I've had this long distance and long-term love affair with the Unitarian Universalist movement. I've dipped in from time to time, as Katie mentioned in her introduction. I've attended some services at First Church a while ago, and I got to know some folks over there, and I got to do some lectures in the evening, and I've been to a couple of the men's groups things up at Camp de Benneville Pines, which is the greatest thing ever, and best kept secret in the Unitarian world. Well, it's not a secret in the Unitarian world, is it? But boy, when you spend some time up there, and I've got to be up there as a participant and as a presenter. I got to be a keynote once for something y'all do called Adult Summer Camp a couple summers ago. That was so cool. The reason I fell in love with the Unitarian movement many years ago was through Ralph Waldo Emerson, who I'd read in high school, right? Everybody used to read Self-Reliance. I don't know if they assign that in high school anymore. They should. But in grad school, I was working on getting my master's degree in philosophy because I wanted to be a community college philosophy teacher. That was my kind of career path. So I was taking care of business at San Diego State as a grad student in philosophy. And I started reading a lot of Ralph Waldo Emerson just as a break, right? Just to take a break from all the other stuff I was reading, which was kind of grinding me down. And Emerson was like he was like fresh water. He was like a pine scented breath of sanity. When I read Emerson, it was like I could finally once again touch the ground. And that made a big impression on me that he could do that anybody could do that a writer or a lecturer could somehow at the same time ground us and inspire us to transcendent awareness. I was really struck by that. And I don't know how that exactly happened, but it certainly did. And I thought maybe I could move in that direction myself. So I ended up writing my master's thesis on Emerson, and I won't take you through all that, but we aren't here to look at ancient history, but I did want to just touch on a couple of things because he's so essential in the Unitarian zeitgeist for 100 reasons. And I want to touch on some of that with you this morning. Many of you know that when he was a young man, Emerson was a Unitarian minister for a few years, and in Boston in the early 1830s. So this is almost a generation before the Civil War, but a crazy time in the United States for sure. He was a minister for a little while, like his father and his grandfather before him, but he quit or he was fired. It depends on which story you look at. And the reason he quit or was fired was because he refused to continue to participate in the ritual of the Eucharist, the communion, which they still did in those days in Unitarian churches, like they do in lots of other more traditional Christian churches. You come up and you get the bread and the wine and all that stuff, and you commemorate the Last Supper, the Eucharist. And he basically told his congregation, I'm not doing that anymore. We're canceling that because I think we're looking back at the past too much. And instead of worshiping some guy that lived 2,000 years ago, we ought to try to be more like that guy here and now. It's a familiar message we're all very used to hearing by now, but it was radical in 1832 to say that in his traditional Boston big Unitarian church, where the wealthiest families, because they donated the most, got the pews up front, all that old school stuff. And so they're like, we don't need your services anymore, Ralph, so you can move on down the line. And it wasn't a good fit for him anyway. And he went out and had this great career as a writer and a lecturer. And like I said, I don't want to look back at the past today with you either in this time that I have. It's not a history lesson, right? Sunday morning talks ought to be invitations to think and feel more deeply into our own investigations into the truth. And that's what I love so much about the credo of the Unitarian Universalist movement, that we're all students here. And there isn't a dogma, there isn't an accepted theology. There is this general sense of all of us leaning together from our unique perspectives into something universal and bigger than any one of us. And that's why I want to look back at Emerson today, not for history, but for inspiration and wisdom that might inform and inflame our own journey through this pathless land. Let me share with you a reading, just a brief passage. By the way, thanks today for the reading in the service from the Oversoul. What a great essay. I'll touch back on that. Somebody asked in the chat, where can I find that? Literally just Google the Oversoul, Ralph Waldo Emerson. I just did. Comes right up. All that stuff, the copyright's expired. You can find it all over the place, free online. It's a great essay, and I'll say more about it a little bit later. But this is a passage from, it's the first couple of sentences from his first book called Nature in 1836. And I want to start here on that theme of kind of a cautionary note about not spending too much time looking back. He starts it this way. He says, our age is retrospective. It builds the sepulchres, the tombs of the fathers. It writes biographies, histories, and criticism. The foregoing generations beheld God and nature face to face, we through their eyes. Why should not we also enjoy an original relation to the universe? Why should not we have a poetry and philosophy of insight and not of tradition, and a religion by revelation to us and not the history of theirs? He goes on, embosomed for a season in nature, whose floods of life stream around and through us and invite us by the powers they supply to action proportioned by nature. Why should we grope among the dry bones of the past, or put the living generation into masquerade out of its faded wardrobe? The sun shines today also. There is new wool and flax in the fields. There are new lands, new people, new thoughts. Let us demand our own works and laws and worship. So there's the opening shot across the bow from Emerson's first few sentences of his first book. And this is a theme that he's going to carry on throughout his entire career. And I feel that so keenly in the Unitarian community as well. There's a rich sense in which, ancient prophets and scriptures and voices and poets and artists and philosophers from all traditions matter a great deal, but we're not archivists. This is about living in a way that is authentic here and now. And by the way, he made a similar call in his address he made to the Harvard Divinity School. He was invited to speak to the graduating class of a whole bunch of freshly minted Unitarian ministers at Harvard Divinity School, and he went there and he gave a talk. It's called it's called the Divinity School Address. If you're on an Emerson tear later, look that one up as well. It's really awesome. This is his advice to these Unitarian ministers that are about to scatter to their parish churches. The doors of the temple stand open, night and day before every person, and the oracles of this truth cease never. It is guarded by one stern condition, this namely, it is an intuition. It cannot be received secondhand. Truly speaking, it is not instruction, but provocation that I can receive from another soul. What he or she has announced, I must find true in me or reject. And on his word or as his second, be he who he may, I can accept nothing. What a remarkable message to impart to these ministers. Look, when you go out and talk in all your church, your parish churches, you can't really offer people wisdom, instruction. All you can do is provoke them to wake up to their own upwelling insight. He goes on in the Divinity School address. This is what he says about Jesus. This is what gets him in trouble with more mainstream Christians, right? He says stuff like this: Jesus Christ belonged to the true race of prophets. He saw with open eye the mystery of the soul. Drawn by its severe harmony, ravished with its beauty, he lived in it and had his being there. One man was true to what is in you and me. He saw that God incarnates himself in us and evermore goes forth anew to take possession of this world. He said, Jesus said, in this jubilee of sublime emotion, I am divine. Through me, God acts. Through me, he speaks. Would you see God, see me, or see thee when thou also thinkest as I think? But what a distortion did his doctrine and memory suffer in the same, in the next, and in the following ages. So he's framing Jesus here as an awakened, divinely realized being like Buddha or any of us could be, and saying that's the real message of Jesus, and most of traditional Christian theology has gotten it wrong or distorted it or looked the other way. That's Emerson's criticism. Take it or leave it. But just a couple more lines from him and then we'll go forward. He also wrote or said in this Divinity School address, he said, historical Christianity has fallen into the error that corrupts all attempts to communicate religion. As it appears to us and as it has appeared for ages, it is not a doctrine of the soul, but an exaggeration of the personal, the ritual. It dwells with noxious exaggeration about the person of Jesus. Ouch, this is pretty confrontational language, isn't it? The soul, he says, knows no persons. There's his non-duality I'll get into a second with you. The soul knows no persons. It invites every one of us to expand to the full circle of the universe and will have no preferences but those of spontaneous love. Wow. So there's a couple of different sections to get us started thinking about Emerson's spirituality. And in my mind, and you're hearing it already, you're hearing it in the reading we did of the Oversoul and in these two passages as well. I think it's one of the most interesting things about Emerson that, and this goes for his young friend, Henry David Thoreau, by the way, who's his neighbor there in Concord, Massachusetts. The two of them were among the first Americans to read complete English translations of the Indian classics of Hinduism. You know, just then coming into Boston Harbor from, British colonial occupation of India. And the British scholars there are translating the Vedas, Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, and those books are coming in to Boston Harbor and they're landing on the shelf at Harvard where Emerson and Thoreau were students when they were younger. And so, in other words, it is largely through the very influential writings of Emerson and Thoreau that the lofty, non-dualistic philosophy of Vedanta or Hinduism entered into the stream of American consciousness. And now we're all saying namaste, and you can get a yoga mat at Target. The conquest is complete. and we are all yogis now. And that started really around 1830 with Emerson and Thoreau. There's a great book about this called American Veda by Philip Goldberg, American Veda. It tells the story really of how these Indian ideas went global. And Emerson's a big part of that. So the connection I'm trying to make with y'all is that I think this Hindu impact had a huge influence on Emerson's spirituality. Listen to this passage. I want to drop one more passage on you from, again, his first book, Nature. It's one of the most famous passages in American religious or philosophical writing. It's one of the most famous mystical experience passages. He was walking through the woods in the winter in twilight, and he had this kind of cosmic experience. And this is what he said about it. In the woods, we return to reason and faith. There, I feel that nothing can befall me, no disgrace, no calamity, leaving me my eyes, which nature cannot repair. Standing on the bare ground, my head bathed by blithe air and uplifted into infinite space, all egotism vanishes. I become a transparent eyeball. I am nothing. I see all. The currents of universal being circulate through me. I am part or parcel of God. I am the lover of uncontained and immortal beauty. In the wilderness, I find something more dear and connate, relatable, than in streets and villages. In the tranquil landscape, and especially in the distant line of the horizon, man beholds somewhat as beautiful as his own nature. Now, what Emerson there just called universal being is, of course, in Vedanta, Brahman Atman, the one. If you're reading the Gita or anything else in English, it's translated as self, capital S, the universal self. When we say namaste, we are saying the universal self that is my essential core recognizes and honors the universal self that is your essential core. So there are no persons. That's what he meant in another passage. There's no egos, there's no people. Those are just temporary containers. What we really are is this universal consciousness. It's the classic claim of all the mystical traditions, and in a word, non-duality, that all is one, which is, of course, in the core of the of the very definition of Unitarian Universalist. So this is, there it is. There's the essential nugget. And yet Emerson is not a head in the clouds mystic. He doesn't want to go live in a cave and just contemplate the beatific oneness. And that's why today's talk that I'm doing right now is called Humanism and Spirituality. And here's where I think Emerson really becomes foundational for the Unitarian Universalist project, that I know you know this, Emerson and Thoreau were avowed abolitionists. And even their neighbor down the street in Concord, Bronson Alcott, who you heard, that second piece was was named after. The Alcotts, right? Bronson Alcott's daughter was Louisa May Alcott, who wrote Little Women. And that family was a stop on the Underground Railroad. These people are crazy liberals of Concord, Massachusetts, high risk, hardcore anti-racists. It's pretty exciting stuff. So let me see if I can kind of bring it together here and tie these three chords, these three threads or strands into one chord. The strand of mystical spirituality, that transcendental oneness stuff, and then the strand of humanism, and then the strand of political action, bringing that consciousness of oneness into the way one actually shows up in the world. And I don't think I have to work too hard here, because anyone in this community understands intrinsically and already lives and breathes in that intersectional space between those three things: mysticism, humanism, and action. So we've seen and heard a little bit about Emerson's mystical side, but what about the humanism? What does that word mean? Humanism is big and confusing and can mean a lot of different things, and I don't want to prattle on too long about this, but also it's dangerous to reduce it down to a bumper sticker. But basically, humanism is this idea that human beings already, as they are, contain all they need to lift themselves and each other up toward higher truth and increasing justice. By employing reason, intuition, muscle, and our imaginations, we can collaboratively improve the world. And sure, some humanists are secular or agnostic or atheist, just as some of us are. and some of them are more, theistic, or it's the whole spectrum. But at the core is that that idea that we're not wretched, powerless creatures in need of divine intervention. We work in collaboration with the divinity that may or may not be, and we show up with the sense that we're the ones that have to do it. We're the ones with the hands that have to do it. And so I'm very convinced that humanism and spirituality and political activism can be synthesized into one life. In fact, I know they can. Emerson demonstrated it. Many of us demonstrate it every day. And here's how. Here's how they're connected. By recognizing that what we are, what human beings are beings of infinite divinity and significance. And that at the core, we are mysterious beings. We're not self-caused. We are manifestations of the ground of being. In Emerson's essay, The Oversoul, he says, we're like fountains in a beautiful garden. I'm over here and you're over there. And we think we're separate, but all of us are drawing water from the same well. So that's how Vedanta gets into Emerson's sort of uniquely American voice. And that's how it kind of gets inside of all of us. So, look at how many of our great human rights reformers had deep roots in spiritual experience. Sojourner Truth, Gandhi, King, Nelson Mandela, Thich Nhat Hanh. The list is endless. Out of their tradition, whether it's Hinduism, the Black Church, all kinds of different places. And isn't that what we do and thousands of congregations are doing all over the world in all the religions, inspiring each other to be brave, to be bold, and to do the right thing. And I'll close with this. I've been reading a lot of Abraham Joshua Heschel lately, the great 20th century Jewish mystic and professor who marched with Dr. King, by the way. And the idea of tikkun olam in Judaism, that divine mandate to participate in the healing of the world. And in my anti-racism work, when I do training in that area and work on that kind of thing with largely white folks who look a lot like me, who are racism skeptics, who don't believe that, racism, we've solved that. Obama was president. We're done. Everything's fine. The more you talk about racism, the worse you make it, and that kind of thing. Yeah. When I work with those folks and try to melt their resistance to the idea that racism isn't primarily a personal moral failing, it's an institutional structure designed and implemented many generations ago. And those institutional structures ensure that people who look like me, people who live in white bodies, get unearned privileges generally not available to people of color, indigenous people, queer people, even women. So that whole structural racism argument is a really tough sell, as you all know, if you read the paper, all this debate about CRT and all that stuff. We don't want to make little white kids embarrassed and stuff. So that's a hot topic, I know, and I think your speaker next week might touch on that some more. But as I try to do that little piece of tikkun olam, to do what I can to lift my small end of the stick, I'm reminded of a line from Abraham Joshua Heschel that I often share with them in these anti-racism workshops. Heschel said this. He said, "Few are guilty, but all are responsible." Few are guilty, but all are responsible. And I think that's I just want to tattoo that on my forehead so everybody can see it when they walk up to me. Stop feeling guilty. Stop having shame. None of us built these systems. Nobody alive today built these systems, but I sure benefit from them because of the total DNA accident of how I look. So, and my whole life, my whole career arc, my economic prosperity and everything. So that's a way that in my thinking, I connect the spirituality, the humanism, and the activism. We joyfully own our own responsibility, not as a burden, not as a shame, but as a encouraging opportunity to show up differently because we share that Vedanta view that we really are all one, that I am not just my brother's keeper. I am my brother. And as the psalmist wrote, be still and know that I am. And all the barriers between all these things start collapsing. And so finally, that means we don't have to reinvent the wheel or solve the world's problems with our cleverness. We just have to learn how to be still and cultivate the wisdom to recognize the solutions already arising unbidden from deep within one another. And I know that's what happens here every Sunday and every day in our individual practice. And then we have to do is just show up, awake, and get to work. Namaste.